My daughter-in-law smiled as she tricked me into signing away my entire life savings, and my own son just watched, convinced I was too old and confused to be trusted. They isolated me, treated me like a child, and planned to drain my accounts to fund her lavish lifestyle. My ungrateful family thought they had me trapped. But they made one critical mistake. They forgot I'm not just a frail old woman. They had no idea I was patiently setting a perfect legal trap, and the justice I was about to deliver was something they never saw coming. You know, the trouble didn't start with a bang. It started with the clinking of champagne flutes at my son Mark's house in Westport. Their home is beautiful, of course, one of those modern farmhouses with more glass than wall decorated to look casually perfect, like a magazine cover. My daughter-in-law Ava was hosting one of her Sunday brunches, a meticulously staged affair where everything from the artisanal cheese to the scatter cushions is designed to scream success. I was sitting there watching her play the perfect hostess, refilling glasses, laughing a little too loudly at someone's joke. But as a retired nurse, I've spent 40 years observing people, and I know how to spot a fever hiding behind a healthy-looking face. Ava's smile was brittle, like a piece of glass about to crack. And her thumb never stopped swiping across the screen of her phone, which she kept just out of sight behind a vase of ridiculously expensive lilies. There was a low hum of tension in the air that had nothing to do with the conversation about summering in the Hamptons. It was all coming from her. In the weeks that followed, that tension found a new focus: me. Ava launched what she called a campaign of care. It was suffocating. She insisted on managing all my appointments, telling me that at my age I shouldn't have to deal with the stress. She started screening my calls, explaining that she was just protecting me from pushy salespeople. My old friends would call and get Ava's cheerful, firm voice, telling them I was resting, and she'd pass on the message. Of course, she rarely did. My financial advisor called to schedule our quarterly review, and Ava told him she'd handle it, that she was now the family point person for my affairs. It was all framed as this loving, doting concern, but it felt like the walls were closing in. I was being gently, smilingly isolated. And my son Mark. He's a good man, but he's always been conflict avoidant and buried in his work. He just saw a devoted daughter-in-law finally stepping up, and he told me how lucky we were to have her. Then came the day of the betrayal. It happened so fast, a blur of motion and manipulation. Ava arrived at my house in a flurry, all expensive perfume and breathless energy. She was clutching a thick stack of papers, her car still running in the driveway. She explained it was just a minor update to the family's estate plan. She said their lawyer suggested it's something to simplify things for Mark later on. She kept talking, not really letting me get a word in, going on about a charity luncheon she was already late for. She flipped through the pages, a confusing sea of legal jargon, and then just pointed to a signature line on the very last page. She put the pen in my hand, tapping her watch with a strained smile. I was distracted, flustered by her whirlwind energy, and I trusted her. I trusted that my son's wife wouldn't hurt me. So I signed it. I signed what I later learned was a durable power of attorney, handing her the keys to my entire financial life. That evening, I was trying to find a moment of peace. My grandchild was staying the night, and I'd put him to bed upstairs. I took the baby monitor out to the garden with me so I could hear if he woke up while I did some quiet weeding. The air was cool and calm, the only sound the chirping of crickets. And then, a new sound crackled through the monitor's speaker. It wasn't the baby. The device must have picked up a signal from the guest room where Ava was making a call. Her voice was nothing like the charming hostess or the caring daughter-in-law. It was a raw, panicked whisper, thin and sharp with fear. I heard her say the deposit was due Friday. Then she said, no, she didn't have it yet. And then came the words that froze the blood in my veins. She told the person on the other end that I, her mother-in-law, was handling it. She said the signature was secured. All they had to do now was wait for the transfer to clear. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now let's get back to it. I barely slept that night. The crickets in the garden that had seemed so peaceful just hours before now sounded like a mocking chorus. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear Ava's thin, panicked whisper playing over and over in my head. The signature is secured. The shock from the night before didn't fade with the morning light. It hardened into something cold and heavy in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't just a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was a calculated betrayal. 40 years as a nurse taught me that you don't panic in a crisis. You observe, you document, and you make a plan. And as I sat at my kitchen table watching the sun rise, my plan began to form. The first step took place the very next day at another one of those tense family dinners. I played my part perfectly, the slightly frail, slightly forgetful matriarch. I let Ava fuss over me, let Mark ask if I was feeling all right. Then right in the middle of dessert, I put down my fork and looked at my son. I made my voice sound as innocent as possible as I asked him the question I'd been rehearsing all day. I told him Ava had mentioned they'd both spoken to the lawyer about updating the estate plan, and I must be getting forgetful because I didn't recall him mentioning it. I asked him what the lawyer's specific concerns were. You could have heard a pin drop. The question just detonated in the middle of the dining room. Mark looked completely and utterly bewildered. He told me they hadn't spoken to their lawyer in months. And Ava, she froze. It was like watching a film suddenly pause. She was a deer in the headlights, her fork halfway to her mouth, her eyes wide with sheer panic. Then just as quickly she tried to recover, she jumped in with a brittle laugh, saying she must have misspoke, that she meant her financial advisor had suggested it, and the lawyer would of course review it later. The lie was so clumsy, so transparent. The two stories clashed in midair, and the room grew thick with unspoken accusation. I knew it, and she knew that I knew it. The desperation behind her whole scheme was suddenly amateurishly clear. The next morning, I made my move. I called Ava and told her I had a splitting headache and wouldn't be able to join her for the walk she'd insisted on. The moment I hung up, I felt a surge of freedom. I went to the back of my closet to an old shoebox where I keep things no one knows about. Inside was a prepaid burner phone I bought years ago just in case. I took it out to the garage, sat in my car, and made one crucial call. I called Linda, a woman I'd worked with in the ICU for 20 years. She's got a mind like a steel trap and a loyalty you could build a house on. I kept my voice low and told her in coded language that I needed a health consultation for a rather sensitive condition. I asked her if she could find me a C specialist, someone who deals with cases where a patient's wishes are being ignored. She didn't ask questions. She just said she'd have a name for me by the end of the day. My first ally was in place, but my little probe had spooked Ava badly. Sensing she'd been caught in a lie, she escalated her campaign of care into outright oppression. A few days later, my mail stopped coming. When I asked the postman, he said he'd received a formal request to forward all my mail to Mark and Ava's address for my safekeeping. Then I tried to check my bank balance online and found my password had been changed. When I called Mark, he sounded concerned, but not for the reason he should have been. He gently explained that Ava had told him I was getting confused and making mistakes with my finances, and she was just helping to protect my accounts. That's when I truly understood. This wasn't just about stealing my money anymore. This was about stealing my mind, my credibility, my freedom. The gilded cage she had built around me now had iron bars. When you find yourself in a cage, you don't rattle the bars. That only tells the zookeeper you're awake. No, you study the lock. After realizing Ava had cut me off from my own life, I knew a direct confrontation would be pointless. She had my son convinced I was losing my mind. If I screamed and raged, I would only be proving her right. So I did the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I gave her exactly what she wanted. I executed a strategic retreat. I became frail. I started forgetting things, asking Ava the same question twice in an hour. I thanked her with teary eyes for handling my complicated affair, telling her it was all just too much for me now, and she bought every bit of it. You could see the relief wash over her. The brief panic she felt after my question at dinner was gone, replaced by a smug, arrogant confidence. She thought she had won. She thought the old lady was finally subdued. And that false sense of security made her beautifully, wonderfully careless. It was her carelessness that gave me the first real glimpse into the depth of her desperation. With all my mail being forwarded to her house, a few things were bound to slip through the cracks. One day, while bringing in my trash cans, I found an envelope caught under the hedge, a letter the mailman must have dropped. It was a credit card statement, but it wasn't addressed to me. It was for Ava, sent to my address by mistake. My hands shook as I opened it. The balance was staggering well into 6 figures on a card with an interest rate that was practically criminal. It listed pages of purchases, designer boutiques, 5-star hotel spas, extravagant party planners. It was a roadmap of a life lived on borrowed money and frantic pretense. And at the top, in bold red letters, were the words, "Final Notice." Right then, I could picture her perfectly sitting alone in her pristine SUV in some secluded parking lot, not shopping, but frantically juggling payment dates on her phone, drowning in a sea of debt she'd created just to keep up with the other wives in Westport. The boutique wasn't a dream. It was the only lifeline she could imagine, and she was willing to sacrifice me to grab it. While Ava thought I was at home, napping or watching daytime television, I was hard at work. My library card became my most valuable possession. The public library was my new office, my secret headquarters. Linda had gotten back to me within a day, just as I knew she would, with the name of a lawyer, a Mr. Davies, who specialized in elder law and financial exploitation. Using a secure email account I created at the library, I began communicating with him. He told me exactly what I needed to do. So during my naps, I'd go through the boxes in my attic, pulling out old paper files, bank statements, and tax returns. I pieced together a complete financial picture of everything I owned. I found the original copy of my will signed and notarized years before Ava ever entered our lives. And I started a log, just like the meticulous charts I used to keep at the hospital. Every phone call Ava screened, every piece of mail that went missing, every condescending comment she made about my confusion, it all went into the log with dates, times, and details. The final piece fell into place thanks to Ava's own bloated confidence. Bloated with the belief that she had complete control, she made her critical mistake. A few years ago, Mark had set up a shared family cloud account so we could all see pictures of my grandchild as he grew up. It was a lovely idea, and it also, without Ava realizing, it backed up recent text messages. One afternoon at the library, feeling a bit lonely, I logged in to look at photos of my grandson. And there it was, a message thread between Ava and her sister from the day before. Ava had used the fraudulent power of attorney to apply for a massive bridge loan to secure the lease on her boutique, using all of my assets as collateral. Her text to her sister was dripping with smug triumph. She wrote that the deal was done and that the old bat's nest egg was finally doing some good. I saved a screenshot of that conversation. It was the last piece of the puzzle, the final undeniable proof I needed. The lock on my cage was about to break. Holding that screenshot on my phone felt like holding a key. For weeks, I had been a prisoner playing the part of a frail, confused old woman. Now it was time to walk out of my own cage. Mr. Davies and I had a plan, and it was designed for maximum impact. We knew Ava was hosting one of her important dinner parties on Thursday night, a gathering of the very people whose approval she was desperate to keep. The timing was perfect. I sat in the passenger seat of Mr. Davies' car, parked just down the block from my son's house. I could see the warm glow from the big picture windows and hear the faint sound of laughter. I wasn't nervous. After everything that had happened, all I felt was a cold, quiet certainty, like a surgeon before the first incision. Mr. Davies was the perfect man for the job. He wasn't aggressive or loud. He was calm, professional, and had an aura of unshakable authority. He walked up to their front door at precisely 8 o'clock, just as they would be serving dessert. I had gotten out of the car and stood in the shadows of a large oak tree across the street, where I could see everything through the glass walls of their dining room. I saw the moment the door opened, the surprise on my son's face. I saw Mr. Davies step inside and calmly hand Ava a sheaf of official-looking papers. He spoke to her in a low voice, but I knew what he was saying. He was serving her with a temporary injunction, freezing her access to my accounts, and a formal notice of legal action to invalidate the power of attorney on the grounds of fraudulent inducement. He also, as we planned, mentioned the name of the lender she had contacted. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Ava's sophisticated facade didn't just crack. It shattered into a million pieces. The wine glass she was holding slipped from her fingers and crashed to the floor. For a second, there was a stunned silence, and then she just collapsed. Not a graceful swoon, but an ugly animal breakdown. She started sobbing these horrible gasping sounds right there in front of her stunned husband and horrified guests. And then it all came pouring out. She confessed everything. The maxed-out credit cards, the secret loans she'd taken out in Mark's name, the crushing, suffocating debt. She wailed about the terror of being exposed as a failure in a town where that was the ultimate sin. The hidden, desperate history of her life was laid bare for everyone to see. The fallout was immediate. My son Mark was paralyzed, his face a mask of white shock. He was caught between the woman he thought he had married and the mother he had so easily dismissed. Ava's sister, who was at the party, did the one thing I expected her to do. She tried to save herself. She immediately started blaming Ava, saying she had no idea it was this bad, that Ava had been reckless. The fragile conspiracy of their shared secrets fractured instantly as self-preservation kicked in, and that was my cue. I walked out of the shadows up the stone path and through the still open front door. I was no longer the frail, confused woman they thought they knew. I was calm. I was strong. And I was in complete control. I didn't yell or cry. I surveyed the wreckage of the dinner party, my eyes finally landing on my son and daughter-in-law. I told them, my voice even and clear, that this is what we were going to do next. I dictated my terms, full disclosure of every single debt, the immediate cancellation of the fraudulent loan application, and a formal meeting at my lawyer's office in 2 days. Stripped of all their power, looking up at me in terror, all they could do was nod. The 48 hours leading up to the meeting were the quietest I had ever known. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the frantic buzz of my phone. As Ava and Mark tried to call texts I left unread. They were walking on eggshells, terrified of what was to come, and I let them. When the day finally arrived, the conference room at Mr. Davies' law firm felt as sterile and imposing as an operating theater. I had asked Mr. Davies to arrange for everyone to be there. Not just Mark and Ava, who looked pale and exhausted, but our family's longtime financial advisor, a man who had known my husband for 30 years, and Ava's own parents, whom I'd flown in under the pretense of a serious family emergency. This wasn't just about getting my power back. It was about creating a tribunal of witnesses so the truth could never be buried or twisted into a new lie. Mr. Davies began, and with methodical precision, we presented the case. There was no yelling, no theatrics, just cold, hard facts. First, we laid out the timeline of deception using my own log to detail the weeks of isolation, the screened phone calls, the lies about my confusion. Then, Mr. Davies presented the fraudulent power of attorney document next to my original will, showing the stark discrepancy. After that came the financial evidence, the misdirected credit card statement that revealed her motive, and the application for the bridge loan against my assets. Ava started to cry at that point, beginning a tearful narrative about being a desperate victim, but she was cut short when Mr. Davies placed the final piece of evidence on the polished table, a large color printout of the text message she'd sent to her sister. The one calling me an old bat and bragging that my nest egg was finally doing some good. The room fell completely silent. In that silence, the judgment came. And the most powerful part was that it didn't come from me. It came from the others. Ava's father, a proud, decent man, just stared at the text message, and I saw his shoulders slump. He didn't look angry. He looked hollowed out by a disappointment so profound it was heartbreaking. He looked at his daughter with the eyes of a stranger. Our financial advisor, a man of integrity, cleared his throat and spoke about the clear and calculated nature of the fraud, expressing his professional condemnation and shock. But the final blow came from my son. I watched Mark as he looked at all the evidence, laid out the entire sordid story in black and white. And I could see the last vestiges of denial finally crumbling, the full weight of his own willful blindness crashing down on him. Their collective condemnation, the shame reflected in the eyes of the people whose respect Ava craved most, was her true punishment. Then it was my turn. I delivered the final consequences, my voice as steady and calm as it had ever been. I informed them that the fraudulent power of attorney was, of course, being irrevocably rescinded. Furthermore, I was placing all of my assets into an ironclad trust, effective immediately, with my friend Linda as a co-trustee. My life savings were now and forever untouchable. I told them I wasn't going to see them thrown out on the street. How they dealt with their mountain of debt was their problem to solve. But I was setting a firm, unbreakable boundary. Mr. Davies slid a final document across the table. It was a formal restraining order, not against their persons, but preventing Ava from ever contacting me directly or indirectly about any financial matters. All future communication on that topic for the rest of our lives would go through our lawyers. It wasn't cruel. It was a clean, permanent legal firewall. Justice was served. Walking out of that conference room felt like taking the first real breath of fresh air after a long illness. There was no joy, no sense of victory, just a profound, quiet relief. The storm had broken, and now we all had to live in the world that came after. The consequences for Mark and Ava were swift, just as you'd expect in a town built on appearances. The whispers of financial implosion and fraud spread like wildfire through Westport. Within a month, a "for sale" sign was staked into the manicured lawn of their beautiful modern farmhouse. Their social circle, the one Ava had spent years and a fortune cultivating, quietly evaporated. They moved into a small rented townhouse on the other side of town, their glittering facade of wealth and success shattered for good. In the months that followed, they began to walk two very different paths. My son Mark called me about 2 weeks after the meeting. It was an awkward, shame-filled conversation, but it was a start. Humbled and finally awake to his own willful blindness, he started going to therapy to understand his deep-seated avoidance of conflict. He's slowly, tentatively started to rebuild a relationship with me. It's supervised for now, mostly just quiet visits with my grandson, but it's an honest start, and for that, I am grateful. Ava, however, chose a different road. From what Mark has carefully told me, she remains bitter. She vacillates between wallowing in self-pity and blaming me for not being supportive of her dream. In her mind, she is still the victim of an unfair world showing no real capacity for genuine accountability. Some people I've learned would rather live in the ruins of their own making than admit they held the hammer. As for me, I started to thrive. The oppressive anxiety that had been a constant weight was just gone. I was free. I reconnected with my old friends, Linda especially, enjoying long lunches and walks without having my calls screened or my time managed. I took a trip to the coast of Maine, something I'd wanted to do for years, just because I could. I used the money that Ava had tried so desperately to get her hands on to establish a small scholarship for nursing students at our local community college. It felt right, turning the resources I had defended into a tool to help build up others in a profession I loved. I was no longer just a mother or a grandmother. I was Irene again, a respected, active member of my community, living with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. About 6 months later, I was sitting in a small cafe downtown on a Tuesday morning, just enjoying a cup of coffee and the newspaper. I happened to glance out the window, and I saw her. Ava was walking on the other side of the street looking stressed and hurried, carrying grocery bags. She wasn't wearing designer clothes. She just looked ordinary. For a split second, our eyes met across the glass. I felt no anger, no spike of adrenaline, nothing but a calm finality. She saw it too, I think, because she quickly looked away, her face flushing, and hurried down the street. The boundary was real and it was permanent. I turned back to my table, picked up my cup, and took a serene sip of my coffee, secure in the knowledge that I had taken the worst of my pain and transformed it not into petty revenge, but into unbreakable wisdom and a well-deserved and very quiet peace. In the end, Irene's story teaches us a powerful lesson about the nature of true strength. When faced with a desperate betrayal born from fear and social pressure, she didn't respond with rage. Instead, she chose a path of methodical precision and unwavering resolve. Ava's actions, while driven by a very real and relatable panic, were a clear violation. Irene's victory wasn't in crushing her daughter-in-law, but in building an unbreakable legal and emotional fortress around herself. It shows that the ultimate justice isn't about seeking revenge, but about wisely and calmly reclaiming your own peace and security.